So the next subject in this planetary health session is wildfire management and wildfire ecology. And now I have the honor to introduce Dr. Toddi Steelman, PhD and President at Sternberg Dean, Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. Dr. Steelman's broad research agenda focuses on improving the governance of environmental and natural resources, emphasizing the role of the public and community in science, policy, and decision-making interactions. She has 20 years history working on the human dimension of wildfires, and her research agenda has focused on understanding community responses on how communities and agencies interact for more efficient wildfire management. Dr. Steelman also has a long history with Rotary, which we as Rotarians, of course, are proud of. She started already as a Rotary exchange student in 1983 in Australia, and as a Rotary Foundation scholar, she spent a year in Zimbabwe studying international development in 1989. So we are so excited to welcome Dr. Toddi Steelman. Please, the scene is yours.
Thank you so very much for that very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are when you're viewing this. And a real pleasure to be with Rotary again, which has had a very formative impact on my entire life. I just want to say thank you to Gunilla and to Christopher for extending this incredibly kind invitation and giving me a platform to talk about something that I care about very, very much, which is wildfire, among other sorts of things. I'm the president of the International Association for Wildland Fire and Sternberg Dean at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. And this is a picture of our research team out on a fire back in 2018. So it's as you can see, we get a lot of pleasure out of doing this particular research. And today I've got a presentation for you that focuses on wildfire futures, the potential paths for change. And one of the things I like to talk about typically when I'm talking as dean or as the president of IAWF or to groups like you is that in many cases, we are stuck in what I would call narratives of despair, narratives of the apocalypse when we talk about fire and climate change and those sorts of things. And I'm really encouraging us to find greater narratives of hope, to talk about the positive impacts that we can have as scholars, as researchers, as citizens. So I think we have an obligation, both in the International Association for Wildland Fire and as a university researcher, to give hope to the next generation and to the public and to point out what is possible. And so that's a big focus of what I have for you today. But of course, we have to start on defining the problem. And I want to make sure I set the stage for you well. So let's start with the general idea that hot, dry, and windy weather leads to big fires. And our climate models suggest that we're going to see more intense weather events, which means more concentrated rainfall events. And counterintuitively, when we have more concentrated rainfall, that also means we have more rain-free days, and then higher maximum wind speeds. So if hot, dry, windy weather creates big fires, we're in for more of that according to our climate models. And we know that climate change is driving part of the changes that we see in wildland fire behavior. We also know that human intervention, whether it's in the settlement patterns, as you see here today, or natural resource management, have also exacerbated the challenges that we now face in wildfire. And so these are very complex systems. And the key question is, what can we do about that? So to understand what we can do about that, we have to start with sort of the foundation of why we have the problem as well. So let's start with two questions. The first is, what do you need to start a fire? So to start a fire, you need fuel, you need an ignition source or heat, and you need oxygen, and that's the fire triangle. And then we ask the second question. So how is climate change changing wildfires? We understand these dynamics. So let's start with changes to fuel. Warming and drought causes vegetation to dry out, and drier fuels means they're more ready to burn. And in the United States, what we have seen over the past 40 years is that fire weather season length and fire weather season severity have increased. So that means fire season is longer, and in some cases approaching a fire year. And today I'm going to be talking about the United States, and in particular the Western United States, but I also have several global examples, because I think it's important to think about what's happening in a smaller place and then scope out to understand what the implications are more globally. It's not just an issue facing the United States or the Western United States, I think, is the upshot there. And, you know, as this map sort of indicates, these trends are occurring globally. The data here are from 1979 to 2015 and confirm that fire seasons are becoming longer. So the darker red and orange colors depict longer days where we see longer fire season, and the cooler colors depict shorter seasons. So you can see, yeah, we definitely see that in the Western United States. We see it down into Mexico. We see it across South America. We see it in Africa and across the Mediterranean areas and into the Middle East as well. So I think all of that is pretty important to understand. So warming is causing longer fire seasons, which puts vegetation or trees under more stress, and it makes them more ready to burn. So we have a double whammy when it comes to fuels. We have warming and drought, and we have a longer duration of time during which that vegetation is under stress. And that's what's important to understand there. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that decades of forest and fire management have contributed to the challenges that we face. So land use management, along with wildfire suppression, putting the fires out, has resulted in ecosystems that are outside of the historical ranges in terms of burning cycles. And that results in the buildup of fuels that create ripe conditions for wildfire. So we have a buildup of what's out there in the forests that are ready to burn. So that's how we understand what's happening with fuels as part of the fire triangle. Next, you need heat and a spark to start a fire. So what are the common ignition sources? So with wildfires, we have two common ignition sources, lightning and people. More heat in our atmosphere results in more lightning. So many studies project an increase in global lightning with climate change because lightning is positively correlated with surface temperature, at least on short time scales. So that's part of it. But humans also cause fire. And in the United States, I'll use this as a reference point, 84% of all wildfires are human caused and account for the expansion of fire season. So what we have is a long fire season. We have main fire season, it's in June, July, and August. But then on the shoulders of those months, we have spring and fall. And those shoulder seasons, we're seeing more human caused fires. So in June, July, and August, we see lightning started fires. And in May, and then into September and October, we see more human caused fires. So people and dry fuels cause a longer fire season, if that makes sense. So those patterns differ regionally and across the world. So this is just a map of global fire regimes and ignition sources. So the map displays the prominent causes, types, and frequency of fire. And what I would draw your attention to is, for instance, the brown area at the top of that one map. It's a boreal forest up into Canada. That's where you would have a crown fire, something that runs across the crown of the canopy. And you can see there's an N. It happens with medium frequency. There's an N there. That means they're naturally caused by lightning. In contrast, the green, the dark green area that's all over the globe, that's where you would get surface fires. So it's really across the surface, not across the crown of the fire canopy. It happens with lower frequency. And there's an H there, it's human caused. So what you start to see is that across different vegetative types, we've got different ways for fire to travel and how it gets started. So the upshot here is that climate change is affecting wildfire and will continue to affect wildfire, but that's not the whole story. To this mix, we add humans, because at the end of the day, we really don't care about wildfire if humans weren't affected, right? It's something that we care about. So the confluence of more wealth and retiring baby boomers enabled more people to move or retire in beautiful forested places. And we've seen this globally happen. The places where forests met where humans live gave rise to the term wildland-urban interface, or WUI. As more people moved into those areas, the need to protect them became more pressing. And we have seen this all over the world over the last many, many years. And so I want to take you on a quick tour of where this has been happening globally, just so you get a sense of where and when and how this has happened. So a real wake-up call occurred with the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, Australia in February of 2009. So that day coincided with the worst bushfire weather conditions ever recorded. Extreme heat, high wind, low humidity, severe drought, all of those were factors in the fires. 173 people were killed, 414 were injured, more than 1 million wild and domesticated animals were lost, over 450,000 hectares of land were burned. So you start to get an idea of the scope. That was a real wake-up call globally for what was happening. We can fast forward to May 2011 in Canada. The Slave Lake fire forced the complete evacuation of Slave Lake's 7,000 residents. The fire destroyed 1/3 of the town. Again, in Canada in 2016, the Fort McMurray, Alberta fires saw the destruction of 2,400 homes, the evacuation of the entire city of 80,000 people. The insured loss was estimated at $3.6 billion and a total economic impact estimated at between $9 and $10 billion in Canada. Still the largest costliest natural disaster in Canadian history. We can move to South America, Chile. In January of 2017, a wildfire described as the worst in Chile's history destroyed the town of Santa Olga, displacing thousands of people. Over to Portugal in Europe in both June and October of 2017, 2 separate fire events spread across, killing more than 100 people in both of those events. Likewise, Greece in 2018, a series of wildfires in Greece started during the 2018 European heat wave that began in the coastal areas of Attica, and then almost 100 people were killed during that incident as well. We can go back to the United States. The Camp Fire, one of the most deadly in modern American history. 86 people were killed, between $7 and $10 billion in insured damages, 13,000 homes destroyed. Australian bushfires, and a lot of people actually have forgotten about these Australian bushfires because they happened in January, February, right before COVID hit, and that really became frontline news. But as you may recall, we had these incredible bushfires in 2019 and 2020 that really happened almost completely across the continent. They burned more than 46 million acres. And to give you an idea of how big that is, that's the size of the entire country of Syria. 3,500 homes, 34 people died, and countless animals and livestock were injured. And then finally, just to this last year, back in California, had another historic year in terms of characterizing a record-setting year of wildfires in California. So again, the idea here is that this is happening globally. It's not just something happening in the United States or in the Western United States. We're seeing it everywhere. So it's no coincidence, and in these wildland urban interface areas, right, the places that we care about, because that's where people live. So it's no coincidence that as more people have moved into the wildland urban interface, that more structures are being lost. The Headwaters Economics Institute, that's a think tank out of Montana, estimates that since 2005, 89,000 structures have been destroyed in the United States, with California leading the way, having 8 out of the 10 most destructive wildfires. And consequently, we see more people, more firefighters, more men and women putting their lives at risk to protect these structures. So the incidence of wildfire deaths is also on the rise. So, and I think this is also interesting. In the United States, fires are getting bigger. We're seeing trends toward fewer fires, but bigger fires. But that's a US trend. We see different trends in other places. For instance, in Canada, we see fewer fires and fewer acres burned. But it's not necessarily an indicator of how many people are affected. So we can't really make generalizations globally about whether we're having more fire, fewer fires, more fires, those sorts of things. It's very country dependent. This is an example of what's been happening in selected countries across the European Union. And as you see, the black line is really what happened in 2019. The blue line is the 10-year rolling average of the number of wildfires. And you'll see on the left-hand side, we're below average, and on the right-hand side, we're above average. So there's no real trend to say, oh, we're burning a lot more acres or we're having a lot more fires. It's highly variable depending on the country, but the impacts are on the increase everywhere. And this map, which was put together by NASA, shows the average size of fires across the world from 2003 and 2016. And the dark red spots indicate large fires. So it gives you an idea of where those larger fires are happening. You know, and I think what's interesting about this is that we see a lot of activity across the north, the boreal forests, a lot of activity in Australia, which would not be surprising given the map that I just showed you about what was happening in Australia, and a lot of activity in Africa, which does a lot of annual burning as well. So the question is then, what do we do about all this? We know we have a very big, complex problem that involves both people and weather and climate and landscapes and vegetation. It's a very complex system, and it's a difficult problem that has been growing for at least the last 100 years. So it's going to take us a while to work our way out of it, and setting our expectations appropriately is an important part of understanding when and how we can have success. And there are a lot of good efforts underway, and these have been underway for some time. And in the United States, our dominant policy is called the National Cohesive Strategy. And so I just want to take you through, we've had more than 25 years of legislation in the United States to address the wildland fire problem. And I think a reasonable question to ask is what does it add up to? So I did a bit of an analysis to try to identify what are the key themes that rise out of those 25 years of legislation. And there are 5 key themes that emerge out of that. Reduce hazardous fuels, respond appropriately to wildfire, build fire-adapted communities, restore fire-adapted ecosystems, and create more opportunities for agency coordination and community cooperation. So those are the 5 things. So we know what we need to do, and we have really been asserting that for 25 years. And what I would say is that those are very similar. We need to be doing, if you were to go to Europe, if you were to go to South America, if you were to go to Australia, if you were to go to Canada, those would be similar approaches that we would need to be taking in many different countries. And it's important because we have some different alternative futures that we can realize, right? On one hand, this is sort of on this narratives of despair and apocalypse. On one hand, we have a terrible future that we could be moving towards, where we see more extreme fire, we see a 12-month fire season, we have higher return intervals for fire, rising fuel levels, where the public is losing faith in our ability to actually tackle these problems. Communities feel overwhelmed by the scope and scale of the challenges that they face, and we see more public health concerns due to smoke in the communities when we have fires burning. Or a more optimistic future, a narrative of hope that we might want to head to, is where we use fire on the landscape when it is burning to actually create opportunities to do more fuel management, if we can manage it effectively and safely, where we have communities that are successfully adapting to coexist with wildland fire in the places where they want to live. We have higher public confidence. We have more prescribed burning, and we are seeing a decrease in the way smoke is affecting public health. So again, we have these 2 alternative futures. So how do we make sure we're making the right choices, that we're moving towards this more positive future? So I hope at least one of the insights that you have gleaned so far is that we have different temporal and spatial scales that are interlocking when we think about problems this way. We can't purely think about them as social problems. We can't purely think about them as ecological problems. They have elements of both, and they intersect at the global, to the national, to the regional, and the local level, right? They are cascading in their consequences. So when we think about policy, and when we think about the activities we want to undertake to proactively address this problem, we have to think about it at these different spatial scales and different temporal scales. So at the global level, we want to think about climate change and climate policy. At the national level, we want to think about landscape level vegetative change or shifts in species structure and the composition. And at the local scale, we would want to be thinking about fuel loading and weather and the number of fires that we have, the structures that are burned, those sorts of things. So when we think at the global level, we have to think at a 100-year time frame. When we think at the national, it's more a decadal time frame. And when we think about the local, it's more an annual or a seasonal kind of time frame in terms of how we address the complexity that we are facing. And so to come back to that, the national policy we have for doing it is called the cohesive strategy, where we want to, one, create fire adapted communities. How can we coexist with more fire on the landscape? How do human communities coexist with more fire on the landscape? How do we create more resilient landscapes? In other words, how can we create healthier ecosystems that can support fire? How do we work towards more safe and effective fire response? In other words, how can we take appropriate risks to protect the people and the places that we care about? So it's these three interlocking areas that we need to work on. So I want to start with, how do we address the issue of fire adapted communities? What does it mean to be a fire adapted community? So a lot goes into this, as you can sort of see from the wordle there in front of you. And while we have three categories, communities, landscapes, and management, all three of these are actually intertwined when we think about what goes into becoming more fire adapted. I really like this slide because it illustrates the social complexity underlying how we can coexist with fires as communities and as humans. You need civic leaders, you need business owners, you need real estate developers, you need first responders, you need land managers and homeowners, all working together if you're actually going to have an impact, because these are very complex social systems. Across the landscape, we also have examples of how people working together have made a difference, but it takes time and it takes a lot of hard work. So this is a map of Lake Tahoe in California. In 2004, you will see the defense zone in red there on the left-hand side. In other words, this was the defensive zone to protect people in the lake from wildfire. And by 2014, it looks a lot safer. It looks a lot different because you can see it's more contiguous. But it takes all of those people that I mentioned in the last slide to come together to create the defensible space around the homes and create larger buffers around communities, and then leverage the public lands. Those are the areas in green and those forest lands to create a buffer that is more protective of both the people and the ecosystems that we all care about. And of course, this only happens when people get together on the ground, day in, day out. And as you will appreciate from that last slide, it took 10 years to achieve that, right? So this is not a problem that developed yesterday. It's occurred over quite a long period of time. It's going to take us a while to work out of it, but we have solutions and we can do that. And then the third leg of the stool is safe and effective fire management. So we want to protect the men and women who put their lives on the line every single day to protect the things that we care about: homes and ecosystems and cultural places and timber stands and ranch lands and everything like that. And so with fires getting bigger, this is also a bigger challenge for us. So to circle back around, we need to think about these different scales where change is needed. And the previous slides address what is needed at the local and the regional and the national levels. But we can't forget climate change, which is the one that's sort of there at the global level. And that's a bit more challenging. And I think we also have a reason for some optimism here. And I'll speak partly from the prism of the United States again. I think we have a window of opportunity that's opened at the macro level in the United States for us. So right now, 76% of Americans who believe in climate change see it as associated with severe weather. So people are seeing and hearing and experiencing their weather, and this is making an impression, right? So people are finally paying attention, at least in the United States. This is not as big a problem in other parts of the world, where we have numerous focusing events like severe weather, and in this case, wildfire, that capture their attention, leading them to believe that something different is needed. And so this is a big cultural shift that we have an opportunity to capitalize on. 72% of Americans see climate change as real and want something done about it. And this was before 2020, which really started to see the needle shift on climate change in the United States. So not only in the United States, but globally as well. So the European Commission, President Ursula von Leyen announced the new Green Deal, which is the centerpiece of the EU Economic Recovery Plan. Great Britain is coal-free now. The industrial economies of South Korea, Japan, and China are really making changes. China most recently announced their own net zero pledge by 2060. We've seen a change of administration in the United States, signified by President Biden on the first day in office, re-signing the Paris Accord. Public and private sectors have really reached a tipping point on these issues, and we're seeing this in the tech and financial sectors as the momentum gains for creating change. And so I see this as one great big historic window of opportunity opening, during which we can actually make real change as it relates to wildland fire and the challenges we face. Because we have to think about change at the global scale, the national scale, the regional scale, and the local scale. So the upshot here is that we have a complex problem, we know what to do, and we have a generational window opening. So as in my dual roles, both as president and as dean, I like to remind my faculty, our students, our alumni, and our membership of the need to move beyond these narratives of despair and talk about these narratives of hope and possibility. And so that was part of what I wanted to do with you all today. I have a lot of reason for hope. We have a complex problem, as I've said, but we know what to do, and we have this window of opportunity to make change. So the upshot, we're all looking for ways to coexist with wildfire. It's not going to go away, but it's also continue to be a world impacted by climate change driving the wildfire problem. And there are actions we can take, behaviors we can change that will help us address our current risks. So with that in mind, I would like to see us all get to work, and I will say thank you and be more than happy to take some questions.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Steelman, for an interesting, important, and also a little bit scary presentation, but you also gave us some hope. So how can we now go from the knowledge and all your experience, research, to have politicians, to have countries making the preparedness for future wildfires? How is it practically going to be done?
Very good question. Very good question. Because I think that especially with wildfire, there's a tendency to focus on the expenditure of funds to putting out the fires and not doing the work to prepare how we avoid the fires, right? Because in any country, there is a bias towards the reactive policy and not the proactive policy, because the proactive policy is indicative of cost avoided. And that's a very difficult policy argument to make, right? So, you know, that's one of the reasons that I cite some of these figures, like in Canada, you know, $9 to $10 billion, the most expensive natural hazard disaster in Canada's history. Similar in California with the Camp Fire, one of the most expensive natural disasters in California's history as well. And so we have to understand that there are big insured losses and other losses that come with these, and that's part of what we have to begin to quantify. So I think that's what policymakers begin to understand, and that for the dollar that you invest in preparedness, you save X number of dollars in terms of costs avoided down the road. So I think those are hard-nosed, sort of empirically based arguments that we need to make. And at the same time, we have to think about lives lost, structures lost, and ecosystems destroyed, cultural resources destroyed, all of these other things that we care about in terms of what we want to do. So I think that with the attention on climate change right now, we have mitigation actions, avoiding putting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then we have adaptation and resilience actions that we can take. And wherever we are, whenever we're talking about adaptation and resilience, that is the preparedness piece. And so I'm also optimistic about our ability to actually move forward some of those arguments, just because of the size of some of the consequences that we've had with some of the more severe weather, not just wildfire, but others. But I think it's keeping our eye on making those arguments to our elected officials and others about the costs that can be avoided and how we become a little bit more proactive in doing so. we know that there are more people that are moving into places where forests and people live. And if you are one of these people, or if you know these people, I think there is a shared responsibility to inhabit those areas responsibly. You are responsible for your own safety. So if you are somebody that lives in a wildland urban interface, make sure you're really educated in how to live in that area safely. Know what your evacuation plan is, know how you're going to get out, make sure you're doing the work around your own property to live there safely so that you can also coexist with wildfire.
Okay, thank you so much again for your inspiring and important presentation. So if you have any more questions for Toddi, please leave them in the webinar Q&As. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.